The biggest mistake a person can make is believing nobody is watching, Officer Ryan Mitchell said with a faint smile as rain pounded against the roof of his patrol vehicle. The detail seemed small in the moment, but it added weight to everything that followed. The words sounded confident, certain, like something he had said before. Interstate 95 stretched through the darkness south of Richmond, Virginia, illuminated by streams of headlights cutting through the storm at nearly 70 miles per hour. It was another quiet reminder that ordinary moments can become important when the truth begins to surface. Water rushed across the asphalt in silver sheets. On the shoulder sat a black SUV surrounded by flashing blue lights. No one in the room could fully understand yet how far the consequences would travel. Inside was a woman who only wanted to get home. Angela Carter had spent the evening visiting her mother at a rehabilitation center after another difficult week of recovery. That silence carried its own meaning, steady and unavoidable. It had been a long day filled with doctor updates, medication schedules, and quiet conversations about better days ahead. The moment passed quickly, but it did not disappear from the larger story. Now all she wanted was a warm cup of tea and a few hours of sleep. Every detail remained exactly where it belonged, waiting to be understood later. Instead, she found herself staring at police lights through a rain-covered windshield. Nothing about the scene looked dramatic from the outside, yet the truth was already gathering strength. Ryan stepped from his cruiser and approached with measured confidence. Rainwater rolled from the brim of his cap as he reached the driver's side window. It was the kind of detail people often overlook until it becomes impossible to ignore. Angela lowered the glass. Cool air and the sound of the storm rushed inside. "Good evening, officer," she said politely. Ryan barely acknowledged the greeting. His flashlight moved slowly through the vehicle. Clean interior, organized paperwork, professional appearance. Then his attention settled on Angela. Something hardened in his expression. Not curiosity, not concern, judgment. The kind that appears before a single fact has been established. "License and registration," he said. Angela handed them over without hesitation. Ryan examined them longer than necessary. His eyes moved between the documents and the woman sitting before him. The detail seemed small in the moment, but it added weight to everything that followed. "Where are you coming from tonight?" he asked. "A rehabilitation center," Angela replied. "My mother is recovering." Ryan nodded slightly, then returned to his cruiser. It was another quiet reminder that ordinary moments can become important when the truth begins to surface. Rain hammered against the highway. Trucks thundered past in the darkness. Angela watched him through her mirror. Something felt wrong. She could not explain why, only that the feeling grew stronger with every passing minute. Several minutes later, Ryan returned. "Please step out of the vehicle." Angela complied calmly. Cold rain touched her face as she stood beside the SUV. Ryan began searching the interior. His movements appeared practiced and deliberate. Then he paused beside her handbag resting on the passenger seat. A faint smile appeared. Seconds later, he held up a small plastic package beneath the flashing lights. No one in the room could fully understand yet how far the consequences would travel. "Well," he announced loudly, "looks like we found something." Time seemed to slow. That silence carried its own meaning, steady and unavoidable. Rain continued falling. Cars continued moving. Yet the moment felt strangely suspended. Angela looked at the package, then at Ryan. Her face remained completely calm. Ryan interpreted that calmness as surrender. He believed the night had unfolded exactly as he intended. "Your future just changed," he said. Angela met his eyes without fear. Her voice remained steady despite the storm. "You should be very careful about what happens next." Ryan laughed softly. The moment passed quickly, but it did not disappear from the larger story. "Is that supposed to worry me?" Angela glanced toward the rain-soaked highway stretching into the darkness. Every detail remained exactly where it belonged, waiting to be understood later. "No," she replied. "It is simply the truth." For a brief moment, uncertainty crossed Ryan's face before disappearing beneath another confident smile. Nothing about the scene looked dramatic from the outside, yet the truth was already gathering strength. He believed he controlled the evidence. He believed he controlled the story. He believed nobody important would ever question what happened on this lonely stretch of road. It was the kind of detail people often overlook until it becomes impossible to ignore. But somewhere far beyond the storm, far beyond the flashing lights, and far beyond his imagination, a silent process had already begun. The details seemed small in the moment, but it added weight to everything that followed. And although Ryan Mitchell did not know it yet, the trap he thought he had created for someone else was slowly closing around him. The drive into Richmond felt longer than it should have. It was another quiet reminder that ordinary moments can become important when the truth begins to surface. Rain continued falling against the patrol vehicle as streams of white and red lights stretched across the wet roads like reflections on black glass. No one in the room could fully understand yet how far the consequences would travel. Angela Carter sat quietly in the back seat, her hands resting calmly in her lap, while the city slowly emerged from the darkness ahead. That silence carried its own meaning, steady and unavoidable. Most people in her position would have been overwhelmed by fear. Most people would have demanded explanations, made frantic phone calls, or argued about what had happened on the side of the highway. The moment passed quickly, but it did not disappear from the larger story. Angela did none of those things. She watched raindrops race each other down the window and listened to the steady rhythm of the storm. Every detail remained exactly where it belonged, waiting to be understood later. Ryan Mitchell glanced into the rearview mirror several times during the drive. Nothing about the scene looked dramatic from the outside, yet the truth was already gathering strength. Each time he expected to see panic. Each time he found the same expression: calm, controlled, patient. The lack of reaction irritated him more than he cared to admit. It was the kind of detail people often overlook until it becomes impossible to ignore. After nearly 15 years in law enforcement, he believed he understood people. The details seemed small in the moment, but it added weight to everything that followed. Fear usually followed accusations. Anxiety usually followed uncertainty. Yet Angela seemed untouched by both. Finally, Ryan broke the silence. "You are taking this surprisingly well." Angela looked up from the rain-covered window. It was another quiet reminder that ordinary moments can become important when the truth begins to surface. "Am I supposed to react differently?" Ryan shrugged. "Most people would." Angela turned her eyes back toward the city lights. No one in the room could fully understand yet how far the consequences would travel. Most people know whether they have done something wrong. The answer lingered inside the vehicle. That silence carried its own meaning, steady and unavoidable. Ryan frowned but said nothing. A few minutes later they passed through downtown Richmond. Government buildings rose above the streets, their illuminated windows glowing through the rain. The moment passed quickly, but it did not disappear from the larger story. Angela recognized many of them. She had spent years working within institutions dedicated to justice and accountability. Every detail remained exactly where it belonged, waiting to be understood later. Tonight, however, she found herself sitting on the opposite side of the process. Nothing about the scene looked dramatic from the outside, yet the truth was already gathering strength. The irony was impossible to ignore. Yet even now she refused to surrender to anger. She remembered her father sitting at the kitchen table when she was a child. It was the kind of detail people often overlook until it becomes impossible to ignore. He worked long hours cleaning school buildings and often returned home exhausted. The details seemed small in the moment, but it added weight to everything that followed. Whenever life felt unfair, he repeated the same lesson. Character matters most when circumstances do not. At the time, she barely understood what he meant. Tonight, those words felt more important than ever. The patrol vehicle finally turned into the station parking lot. Bright security lights reflected across pools of rainwater covering the pavement. Officers moved between vehicles carrying folders and cups of coffee as another ordinary night continued around them. It was another quiet reminder that ordinary moments can become important when the truth begins to surface. To everyone else, this was simply another shift. Another report. Another stop. Ryan stepped from the vehicle and opened the rear door. Angela exited without resistance. Cool air brushed against her face as she looked toward the station entrance. No one in the room could fully understand yet how far the consequences would travel. The building appeared ordinary, almost forgettable. Yet somewhere beyond its walls, events had already begun moving in a direction nobody inside could see. That silence carried its own meaning, steady and unavoidable. As they entered the processing area, fluorescent lights filled the room with a pale glow. The moment passed quickly, but it did not disappear from the larger story. Ryan moved toward a workstation and began typing his report. The sound of the keyboard echoed softly through the otherwise quiet room. Every detail remained exactly where it belonged, waiting to be understood later. Angela took a seat beside a large window overlooking the rain-soaked parking lot. Nothing about the scene looked dramatic from the outside, yet the truth was already gathering strength. Outside, water flowed across the asphalt beneath rows of security lights. Inside, Ryan believed he was documenting the final chapter of someone else's story. It was the kind of detail people often overlook until it becomes impossible to ignore. What he did not realize was that far beyond Richmond, automated systems had already started preserving information connected to the traffic stop. The detail seemed small in the moment, but it added weight to everything that followed. Silent notifications were moving through networks. Records were being secured. Timelines were beginning to form. And while Ryan confidently typed each sentence into his report, the first pieces of a much larger story were quietly falling into place. Lieutenant Sarah Bennett had worked in law enforcement long enough to recognize when something felt wrong. It was another quiet reminder that ordinary moments can become important when the truth begins to surface. Experience had taught her that paperwork could say one thing while instinct whispered another. No one in the room could fully understand yet how far the consequences would travel. Near midnight, as rain continued falling outside the station, she stood in her office reviewing the latest notifications arriving on her computer. That silence carried its own meaning, steady and unavoidable. One message immediately caught her attention. It was short, formal, and unusually urgent. Preserve all records associated with the Interstate 95 traffic stop. Sarah read the instruction twice, then a third time. Requests like this did not appear without reason. She picked up her phone and walked toward the processing area. Fluorescent lights reflected across polished floors as she entered the room. Ryan Mitchell remained seated at his workstation finishing reports. His fingers moved confidently across the keyboard. Across the room, Angela Carter sat quietly beside the window, watching rain slide down the glass. The moment passed quickly, but it did not disappear from the larger story. Sarah paused. Something about the contrast unsettled her. Ryan looked comfortable. Angela looked patient. Yet somehow it felt as though only one of them understood where the night was heading. Every detail remained exactly where it belonged, waiting to be understood later. "How much longer on your report?" Sarah asked. Ryan glanced up. "Almost finished." "Good. Make sure all associated files are preserved." Ryan leaned back slightly. "Everything is already saved automatically." "Verify it anyway," Sarah replied. Ryan frowned. "What is this about?" Sarah hesitated. The honest answer was that she did not know yet. "Just do it." Ryan returned to the keyboard, but his expression revealed annoyance. Nothing about the scene looked dramatic from the outside, yet the truth was already gathering strength. He was not used to being questioned. Over the years, he had developed a reputation for confidence and results. It was the kind of detail people often overlook until it becomes impossible to ignore. Most supervisors left him alone. Most situations unfolded exactly the way he expected. Tonight felt different. Sarah moved toward the window and looked out at the parking lot. Rainwater shimmered beneath security lights. Her phone vibrated again. Another message. This one contained a federal reference number. Sarah's eyebrows rose slightly. Federal involvement was unusual. She opened the attachment and began reading. The further she read, the more serious her expression became. Across the room, Angela remained calm. She folded her hands and watched the reflections dancing across the wet glass. The storm outside reminded her of evenings from childhood. Her father often sat on the porch during summer rainstorms, teaching lessons that seemed simple at the time. "Truth does not rush," he used to say. "It arrives when it is ready." Those words stayed with her now. Ryan finally stood and walked toward Sarah. "Lieutenant, you keep getting messages about this stop." Sarah lowered her phone. "Because people are asking questions." Ryan laughed softly. "About what?" Sarah looked directly at him. "That is what I am trying to figure out." The answer failed to reassure him. For the first time that evening, uncertainty appeared behind his confident expression. Somewhere beyond Richmond, automated systems continued preserving information connected to the stop. Timestamps, location records, data logs, small details most people never noticed. Yet those details were quietly forming a timeline. Back inside the station, the clock on the wall reached 11:43. Sarah received one final message and immediately felt her stomach tighten. This time the instruction was unmistakable. Federal oversight personnel were already on their way. She slowly lowered the phone and looked first at Angela, then at Ryan. One of them appeared surprised by the news. The other did not. And in that moment, Sarah began to suspect that the traffic stop on Interstate 95 was not the story at all. It was only the beginning. The station doors opened just after midnight. The sound was not dramatic. It was simply the ordinary sound of a door swinging inward. Yet the effect on the room was immediate. Sarah Bennett looked up from her phone. Ryan Mitchell stopped typing. Even the steady rhythm of rain against the windows seemed quieter for a moment. A man in a dark suit entered carrying a slim black portfolio. Another followed a few steps behind. Neither appeared rushed. Neither appeared impressed by anyone in the room. They moved with the calm confidence of people who already knew why they were there. Sarah walked forward to meet them. The lead representative handed her official credentials and a packet of documents. She reviewed them carefully. Federal Oversight Division. Evidence Preservation Authorization. Independent Records Review. Every page appeared legitimate. Ryan stood from his chair. "What exactly is going on?" he asked. The representative glanced toward him. "We are here to ensure all materials connected to tonight's traffic stop remain preserved." Ryan folded his arms. "Preserved for what?" "Review." The answer was short and unemotional. Sarah continued reading the paperwork. The list was extensive. Body camera footage, dispatch communications, vehicle location records, evidence logs, digital reports, timestamps, access records. Ryan felt irritation rising. "This seems excessive." The representative looked at him calmly. "Perhaps." Then he paused. "Or perhaps not." Across the room, Angela Carter remained seated beside the rain-covered window. She watched droplets slide slowly down the glass, while distant parking lot lights reflected across the darkness outside. Her calmness contrasted sharply with the growing tension around her. Ryan noticed it again. The woman should have been nervous. She should have been worried. Instead, she looked like someone waiting for a train she already knew would arrive. Sarah lowered the documents. These requests were generated quickly. The representative nodded. "Certain notifications are automated." Ryan immediately focused on that word, automated. The representative offered no further explanation. "The details are not relevant tonight." Ryan stepped closer. "I think they are relevant." The representative met his gaze. "Not to you." The response landed harder than Ryan expected. For years, he had been the person asking questions. Tonight, someone else controlled the conversation. Sarah sensed the shift immediately. She looked toward Angela. "Do you know anything about this?" Angela slowly turned from the window. "I know that records matter." Her voice remained calm. "And I know that facts have a way of surviving." Nobody spoke for several seconds. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. Rain continued falling outside. Somewhere deeper inside the station, a printer began running. The representative opened his portfolio and removed another document. Sarah's eyes narrowed as she reviewed it. This one contained references to independently preserved information connected to the traffic stop. Ryan suddenly felt something unfamiliar. Doubt. Small at first, barely noticeable, yet impossible to ignore. He looked toward the evidence room, then toward his report, then toward Angela. For the first time that evening, he began wondering whether the story he believed he controlled might already belong to someone else. Outside, the storm continued moving across Richmond. But inside the station, another storm had quietly arrived. And unlike the rain beyond the windows, this one was only beginning. The federal representatives remained inside the station long after midnight. Outside, the storm continued sweeping across Richmond, but the rain had begun losing some of its intensity. Water still traced slow paths down the windows, reflecting security lights into long ribbons of gold and white. Inside the processing room, the atmosphere had changed completely. Earlier in the evening, Ryan Mitchell had carried himself with effortless confidence. Now every conversation seemed to happen just beyond his reach. Sarah Bennett stood beside a table reviewing preservation documents while the federal representatives quietly coordinated requests through secure phones and laptops. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody appeared angry. Yet the silence itself felt heavy. Ryan watched them carefully. "I still do not understand why this requires federal attention," he said. One of the representatives closed a folder and looked up. "Because certain review mechanisms were activated." Ryan frowned. "By who?" "Automatically." The answer came without hesitation. Ryan looked toward Sarah. What does that even mean? Sarah folded her arms. It means something triggered oversight protocols. Ryan shook his head. For a routine stop? The room fell quiet again. Across from him, Angela Carter remained seated beside the window. The glow from the parking lot lights illuminated one side of her face, while the rest remained in soft shadow. She looked neither victorious nor frightened. She simply waited. One federal representative opened a laptop and reviewed a series of reference numbers. We have already confirmed preservation of several categories of information, he said. Additional verification is underway. Ryan felt irritation rising again. Verification of what? The representative glanced toward him. Timeline consistency. The words landed harder than Ryan expected. Timeline consistency. Such a simple phrase. Yet suddenly, it seemed to contain far more meaning than it should have. Sarah noticed the change in his expression. She had worked with enough officers over the years to recognize when confidence began turning into concern. Just cooperate, she said quietly. That is the best thing anyone can do right now. Ryan returned to his workstation, but found himself staring at the unfinished report on his screen. Sentences that looked perfectly normal an hour earlier now seemed different. He reread sections repeatedly without making changes. Outside, the rain weakened further. The storm was moving east. Angela watched the final heavy drops strike the glass before sliding downward into darkness. Her father used to say that people often feared silence because silence left room for reflection. Tonight she understood exactly what he meant. The federal representatives continued receiving updates. More records confirmed. More data secured. More requests completed. The process unfolded. Steadily, almost invisibly. There were no dramatic announcements. No sudden revelations. Only the quiet accumulation of facts. Near 1 o'clock in the morning, Sarah received another notification. She opened it and slowly exhaled. The message was brief. Preliminary review initiated. She read it twice before lowering the phone. Ryan immediately noticed. What now? He asked. Sarah looked toward him, then toward Angela. Now, she replied carefully. The facts begin speaking for themselves. For the first time that entire night, Ryan had no response. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. The rain nearly stopped. And somewhere far beyond the station walls, independent records were already beginning to tell a story that nobody inside could rewrite. By 1:30 in the morning, the rain had stopped completely. Richmond sat beneath a blanket of damp silence while streetlights reflected across wet pavement and empty roads. Inside the station, the atmosphere had settled into something quieter than tension. It felt like waiting. Not the nervous waiting of uncertainty, but the slow, unavoidable waiting that comes when events have already been set in motion. Angela Carter remained beside the window, watching faint reflections move across the parking lot outside. The glass still carried traces of rain, and each remaining droplet caught the light like a tiny fragment of silver. Around her, conversations had become softer. The federal representatives continued reviewing records. Sarah Bennett occasionally checked her phone. Ryan Mitchell sat alone at his workstation. Nobody seemed eager to speak. For the first time all night, there was nothing left to argue about. Only time remained. Angela closed her eyes briefly and listened to the silence. Somewhere in the distance, an air conditioning unit hummed. A printer clicked once and stopped. Footsteps echoed from another hallway and faded away. The station felt strangely different from the place she had entered earlier. The urgency was gone. The noise was gone. What remained was reflection. Her thoughts drifted back to her father. She could still remember the small porch where they sat during summer evenings after. Thunderstorms passed through their neighborhood. He often watched the sky clear before speaking. One night she had asked him why some people lied, even when the truth would eventually be discovered. He smiled and pointed toward the clouds moving away above them. Storms always leave evidence behind, he told her. Broken branches, wet streets, fallen leaves. People are no different. Actions leave traces. The memory brought a faint smile to her face. Across the room, Ryan noticed it. The sight unsettled him more than anger ever could have. He had expected fear. He had expected frustration. Instead, he found peace. He looked away and focused on the unfinished report still glowing on his monitor. The blinking cursor seemed almost mocking now. Earlier that evening, every sentence had felt permanent. Every conclusion had seemed secure. Now each line appeared fragile. Sarah walked toward the window, and stood beside Angela. For a moment, neither woman spoke. They simply looked out across the quiet parking lot. "You seem remarkably calm," Sarah finally said. Angela considered the question. "There is no reason to panic when the truth exists." Sarah nodded slowly. She understood more now than she had a few hours earlier. The situation was no longer about allegations or reports. It was about facts, and facts tended to survive. A soft notification appeared on Sarah's phone. She opened it and read silently. Additional verification complete. Preliminary findings consistent. She stared at the message for several seconds before slipping the phone back into her pocket. The process was continuing exactly as expected. Outside, clouds began separating overhead. Through a gap in the darkness, pale moonlight touched the wet asphalt. The reflections shifted. The parking lot seemed brighter somehow. Angela watched the light spread across the ground and felt a sense of calm settle over her completely. The storm had ended. The night had changed. Somewhere beyond the station walls, independent records were aligning piece by piece into a story that could no longer be altered. And as moonlight quietly replaced the rain, Angela understood something Ryan was only beginning to learn. Truth never needs to hurry. It simply waits for the moment when nobody can ignore it anymore. 3 weeks later, Richmond welcomed the first signs of early autumn. The trees lining government buildings had begun exchanging summer green for shades of gold and amber, and cooler air drifted through the city each morning. To most residents, it felt like an ordinary change of season. To the people connected to the events of that rainy night on Interstate 95, it felt like something else entirely. Inside a secure federal office several miles from downtown, analysts sat before large monitors displaying synchronized records collected from multiple independent sources. Timestamps, location data, dispatch logs, evidence chain documentation, vehicle movement records. Every piece of information occupied a place within a growing timeline. The process was methodical and quiet. Nobody celebrated discoveries. Nobody rushed toward conclusions. They simply followed facts wherever those facts led. Across town, Angela Carter had returned to her normal routine. Each morning she arrived at the federal courthouse before most employees. She reviewed case files, attended hearings, and carried herself with the same calm professionalism she had displayed throughout the investigation. Many people who passed her in the hallways never knew what had happened. Others knew fragments, but never heard her discuss it. Angela preferred that. She had spent her life believing that character should speak louder than publicity. Late one afternoon, sunlight poured through the tall courthouse windows and stretched across polished marble floors. Angela stood near her office door speaking with a young law clerk who had asked for career advice. The conversation was simple. Work hard. Be honest. Protect your integrity. As the clerk walked away, Angela glanced toward the city skyline, glowing beneath the afternoon sun. For a brief moment, she remembered the rain-covered window at the station and the long hours that followed. The memory no longer carried anxiety. It carried perspective. Meanwhile, Ryan Mitchell sat alone in a small administrative office reviewing documents he had already read several times. Weeks earlier, he had believed the investigation would disappear. Then he believed it would slow down. Then he believed it would produce nothing significant. Each assumption had proven wrong. The quiet confidence that once defined him had gradually faded beneath a growing awareness that events were no longer unfolding according to his expectations. He stared through the window beside his desk and watched leaves drift across the parking lot below. The world outside looked peaceful. His thoughts were not. Sarah Bennett attended a briefing later that evening. Investigators reviewed newly verified findings and updated timelines. Several records that had originated from completely independent systems aligned with remarkable precision. Sarah listened carefully as analysts explained how each verified detail supported the next. There was nothing dramatic about the presentation. No shocking reveal. No emotional speeches. Only consistency. The kind of consistency that becomes difficult to challenge. As the meeting ended, one senior investigator closed a folder and offered a simple observation. The evidence tells the same story every time we examine it. Sarah looked down at the reports in front of her. For weeks, she had watched facts accumulate one piece at a time. Now the picture was becoming impossible to ignore. Outside, the sun slowly disappeared beyond the Richmond skyline, casting long shadows across the city. Somewhere in the fading light, The final gaps in the timeline were closing. And for the first time since that stormy night, the truth no longer seemed distant. It was arriving. 4 months later, Richmond stood beneath the golden colors of late autumn. Cool air moved through the city streets, carrying fallen leaves across courthouse steps and government plazas. What had begun as a rainy night traffic stop had evolved into something far larger than anyone inside that station had imagined. Inside a federal conference room overlooking the skyline, investigators, attorneys, and oversight officials gathered around a long table covered with reports, timelines, and verified records. Months of careful review had produced a picture that was both detailed and remarkably consistent. Independent preservation systems, synchronized records, location data, communications logs, and procedural reviews all pointed in the same direction. No single discovery had changed the case. Instead, hundreds of small facts had quietly assembled themselves into a truth that could no longer be disputed. Across town, Angela Carter sat inside her chambers reviewing legal briefs beneath the warm glow of afternoon sunlight. The tall windows behind her framed the city in shades of amber and gold. Her routine had changed very little during the investigation. She continued arriving early. She continued preparing carefully for every hearing. She continued treating everyone with the same respect she had always shown. People often expected dramatic reactions when justice arrived. Angela had never shared that expectation. She believed that truth did not require celebration. It required recognition. A soft knock sounded at her office door. Sarah Bennett entered carrying a folder. The two women exchanged a quiet smile. Sarah placed the folder on the desk. "The final review has been completed," she said. Angela looked down at the documents, but did not open them immediately. Instead, she glanced toward the sunlight stretching across the floor. "And?" Sarah exhaled slowly. "The findings are consistent with everything that has been verified so far." Angela nodded once. No surprise crossed her face. No triumph. Only understanding. Meanwhile, Ryan Mitchell sat in a conference room several miles away reviewing the same conclusions from a different perspective. The confidence that once defined him had disappeared months earlier. In its place was reflection. Every assumption he had made on that rainy night now stood exposed beneath the weight of verified facts. He stared at the papers in front of him and realized that authority had never been the same thing as accountability. Outside the window beside him, leaves drifted across a quiet parking lot. The season itself seemed to be moving on. Later that afternoon, official findings became public. News organizations reported that extensive reviews had substantiated serious misconduct concerns and that significant legal consequences remained possible. Some reports referenced potential penalties that could reach 25 years under the most severe applicable outcomes. The headlines spread quickly. Conversations followed. Yet Angela spent almost no time reading them. As evening approached, she left the courthouse and walked down the front steps into the cool autumn air. The setting sun painted the city in warm gold light. People crossed the plaza carrying briefcases, shopping bags, and coffee cups. Life continued exactly as it always had. Angela paused for a moment and watched the sunlight reflect from distant windows. There was no feeling of victory, no desire for revenge, only gratitude that facts had survived long enough to be heard. Above the city, the last light of day slowly faded into the horizon. And as the shadows lengthened across Richmond, justice continued moving forward with the same quiet certainty that had guided it from the very beginning. 1 year later, spring returned to Richmond with clear skies, flowering trees, and the gentle warmth that follows a long winter. The city had moved on from the headlines. Investigations had concluded. Reports had been archived. News crews had found other stories to cover. Yet some moments leave marks that remain long after public attention fades. On a bright Saturday morning, Angela Carter stood outside a community center where students from across the city gathered for a leadership program. Families arrived carrying notebooks and coffee cups while children laughed beneath rows of blooming cherry trees. Sunlight filtered through the branches and painted soft patterns across the sidewalk. Angela greeted each student with the same warmth and respect she brought to every courtroom. To them, she was not a symbol of a national story. She was simply someone who listened. Inside the center, after a discussion about responsibility and integrity, a young girl approached her with a question. "How do you keep believing in fairness when people treat you unfairly?" Angela smiled gently. The question carried her back to a rainy highway, flashing lights, and a night that changed many lives. Yet the memory no longer felt heavy. Time had transformed it into something quieter. Because fairness is not something other people give you, she answered. It is something you continue believing in even when it is difficult. The student nodded thoughtfully and returned to her seat. Later that afternoon, Angela visited her mother. The rehabilitation center looked brighter than it had a year earlier. Her mother's health had improved steadily, and the two women spent hours talking about family memories, future plans, and ordinary life. Through the window beside them, spring sunlight reflected across a small garden where flowers swayed in the breeze. There was comfort in the simplicity of the moment. Across the city, Sarah Bennett continued serving with a deeper understanding of accountability and trust. The lessons from the investigation had influenced policies, training programs, and oversight procedures. She often thought about how easily assumptions could become mistakes and how important it was to question certainty before certainty caused harm. The experience had changed her in ways few people noticed, but she carried those lessons every day. As evening approached, Angela left the rehabilitation center and drove toward a park overlooking the James River. The sky glowed with shades of gold and pale orange. Families walked along the trails. Cyclists passed beneath flowering trees. The city seemed peaceful. Angela parked her car and sat on a bench facing the water. A gentle breeze moved across the river, carrying the scent of fresh grass and spring blossoms. She watched the sunlight dance across the surface of the water and thought about her father. Years ago, he had told her that truth does not need protection from honest people. It only needs time. Looking across the river, Angela realized how right he had been. The storm had passed. The noise had faded. Justice had done its work quietly and completely. As the last light of day settled over Richmond, she stood, took a slow breath, and walked along the river path while the evening sky reflected gold across the water behind her. There were no speeches, no celebrations, only the calm silence that remains when truth has finally been heard.